Good evening, everyone. I am the narrator, and I am here to guide you into a restful slumber with these chilling tales from the neighborhood. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give the video a thumbs up. I would be delighted to hear about your location and the time you're tuning in, so please drop a comment below. When you feel prepared, find a cozy spot and take a moment to unwind. In the spring of 2000, I found myself residing in a loft apartment nestled in Boulder, Colorado. My abode featured a grand window that framed the breathtaking Rocky Mountains, a sight worthy of admiration. Nonetheless, it was somewhat loud, particularly during the rain, as the roof had a slight leak and the air conditioning roared like a freight train. Nevertheless, it was a warm and inviting spot. During that period, I was contributing to a newspaper, and after my shift as a cashier at a hardware store, I dedicated a few hours to refining my articles before heading to bed, typically around 1 or 2 in the morning. Next door, an empty loft sat untouched for years until a middle-aged woman, accompanied by her collection of cats, finally chose to make it her home. On the second floor, it was just the two of us, yet our apartments lacked any numbers or distinguishing features. It was a small detail for me, since I didn't get much communication at home either, but that absence of information turned out to be perplexing and nearly cost me my life. One evening, as I was immersed in my writing, with the soothing sounds of Italian music playing softly in the background, I suddenly had the urge to pour myself a glass of wine. As he walked past my door, I felt a sudden urge to glance through the peephole, acting on instinct without giving it much thought. I was unsure of what I anticipated seeing in the darkness of night. Yet curiosity often overpowers reason. What I discovered, however, was far from comforting. A short, bald man stood at my door, his gloved hands contrasting with his bare feet. I recall his gray socks creating an unusual contrast against the dark wooden floor. A man donned in a mustard-colored jacket and light jeans appeared to be attempting to open my neighbor's door. My heart raced with sudden intensity. I was completely unaware of his identity. I had never encountered him in the building, yet it was his demeanor that truly unsettled me. He was evidently attempting to manipulate the doorknob, shifting it back and forth, as though he expected the door to yield on its own. I remained in place, observing him for what felt like an eternity, perhaps 30 or 40 seconds, striving to maintain my composure and suppress any sound. I believed that if he succeeded in opening that door, I would need to dash to grab my cell phone to dial 911. After a period of unsuccessful attempts, he released the knob and crouched down to access a backpack resting on the floor. In that instant, I caught a clearer glimpse of his face. He was an older gentleman, perhaps around 50, and there was an unsettling aura about him that sent shivers down my spine. My palms started to glisten with perspiration. I carefully shifted away from the door, my drink still in hand, and with deliberate slowness, I placed the glass on the table. I approached the door once more, my palms flat against the wooden surface, as if that simple act could shield me from the presence of the unknown figure beyond. Once more, I peered through the peephole, and I nearly toppled over in shock. The man stood before me, his gaze fixed and wary. A suspicious look etched across his face as he gripped a screwdriver tightly in his left hand. My heart raced wildly, pounding so intensely that I felt I could hear it echoing through the door. The lights in my apartment were off, save for the lamp on my desk, which cast a dim glow in the hallway. I realized that the man would likely have noticed the faint illumination through the peephole. As I became aware of this, a cold sweat began to trickle down my back, and just at that moment, he took 2 more steps forward and started to rattle the doorknob. Fear engulfed me, prompting an instinctive response as I sought to protect myself. I grasped the doorknob on my side, pushing down with all my strength, fully aware that even if I succeeded in opening it, I wouldn't be able to prevent him from entering. In that instant, it seemed like the door was as delicate as parchment. He felt incredibly near, so near that I believed I could hear the rhythm of his breath. He rattled the knob a few more times, but thankfully it remained shut. Ultimately, the reality that I was gripping the handle and applying pressure to it was indeed making an impact. Yet, I felt an overwhelming sense of insecurity. I was filled with dread, sensing the circumstances escalating to an alarming degree. I paused for a moment, contemplating my next move if he succeeded in opening that door. I understood that the separation between us was more than mere wood. It was a fragile line between existence and the potential conclusion of my story. Amidst the chaos, I peered through the peephole again, only to discover his gaze locked onto mine once more. His eyes gleamed with an icy blue hue, a dark sparkle dancing within them that sent a chill down my spine, hinting at the truly sinister intentions he harbored, whether aimed at me or my neighbor. But then, the most unexpected event unfolded. A man rapped on my door. 3 gentle taps echoed, and I caught him murmuring something quietly to himself. I was utterly astonished. Perhaps he sought a response, reveling in the entire situation, yet I found myself frozen, paralyzed, and speechless. Honestly, I could barely catch my breath. I was convinced he knew I was there, as it was impossible for me to hear him from the other side of the room without being right next to him. At last, he remained still before me for what seemed like a lifetime. After approximately 10 seconds, he lifted his backpack and made his way to the stairs, gliding silently due to being barefoot. I was filled with fear, too afraid to turn my back on the door, certain he would return at any moment. To steady myself, I counted to 20 in my head. After taking a deep breath, I made my way across the room to my desk. I clutched my old Nokia and dialed the police, whispering as if that could somehow shield me. I informed the operator about a peculiar man lingering outside my door. After speaking for just over a minute, she assured me that a patrol car was en route. I gazed out the window and spotted the bald man standing on the sidewalk beneath me. When he caught my eye, he waved and then vanished down an alley. I nearly experienced a heart attack and promptly notified the operator of his whereabouts. The police arrived a few minutes later, those minutes stretching out in slow, agonizing anticipation. They interrogated both me and my neighbor, Charlene. It became clear that she had contacted the authorities earlier, having noticed shadows shifting beneath her door. Illuminated by the light in the hallway, that was the moment she revealed a shocking truth. The neighbor disclosed that she was part of the protection program. Before dawn, 2 agents arrived and took her and her cats away, and I never saw her again. Once more, the following day, I visited the police station and provided a description of the man to a forensic artist. But after that, I received no further updates on the case. Even now, I find myself pondering whether that stranger had a particular interest in Charlene, or if he was merely an ordinary thief loitering about, with everything else being nothing more than chance. If I had to speculate, I would find it hard to accept that he was merely an ordinary thief. I propose that the absence of numbers on the doors led to his confusion regarding her apartment, prompting him to take a chance on multiple ones. He vanished without a trace, leaving no word behind. All I possess are my doubts. Yet at times I ponder whether my neighbor might be connected to something far more nefarious. Upon conversing with the police, it became clear to me that her accent originated from Boston. Later that same year, the scandal involving Whitey Bulger and his Winter Hill gang erupted. Then it all erupted in the headlines, revealing shocking details about murders and the corruption involving an FBI agent named John Connolly. The following day, I added 3 more locks to my door. I never encountered that individual or any other unfamiliar face in. I'm back at my house, thank God. I dedicated another 4 years to that place, and the loft next door remained unoccupied forever after. This story serves as a reminder to always trust your instincts. Don't deceive yourself into believing you're secure simply because you're in your own space. If you sense something unusual is happening, don't brush it aside. Not long ago, I returned home from work to discover my girlfriend perched on the sofa, radiating an unusual energy that illuminated her face. When I inquired about what was happening, she delivered the timeless phrase, "We need to talk." At that instant, I realized that something was amiss. She expressed to me her unhappiness in our relationship and suggested that we take a break to explore connections with other people, as if that would clarify whether we truly belonged together or if it was time to part ways. To be honest, I was reluctant to go through with it, but my love for her was strong enough to push me forward. Honor her words. Even though it pained me, I embraced it. I considered that perhaps if I allowed her the opportunity to experience some distance for a time, she could reconsider her feelings. However, a few weeks later, we had already parted ways, and I found myself in the challenging position of needing to vacate the apartment we had shared as it was officially hers. Isolated. In my haste, I began searching for a place to stay. In the rush and chaos of the moment, I neglected to seek out a suitable place and ultimately settled for a one-bedroom apartment in a building that resembled a curious blend of a homeless shelter and a haunted house. However, it was affordable and available right away. That should have been a warning sign, but I was so eager to escape my ex's apartment that I overlooked those details, at least for the moment. The landlord requested just a month's rent up front in return for the keys, and there was absolutely no way I could return to my parents' home. Picture the emotions that would have stirred within you. It felt too much like a regression, so I chose that small studio, which at least appeared to be a better option than returning to my family. I preferred to avoid a dispute with my former partner over the division of furniture, as we had already endured more than our fair share of drama. As long as I had my Xbox and my smart TV, I believed I could endure. One day, briefly, upon settling in, I took the initiative to introduce myself to my neighbor. I could hear a loud beat of music coming from his apartment, so I went over and knocked. When he opened the door, I was taken aback by his unfriendly demeanor. He was a youthful fellow sporting a robust, dark beard, and his accent brought to mind the streets of London. The man barely opened the door, just enough to allow me a glimpse of him through a narrow gap. I introduced myself and mentioned that I had relocated across the hall. I offered my assistance, inviting him to reach out if he ever needed anything. Let me know. Yet, all I got back was a chilly and anxious glance. I sensed that perhaps I was intruding on something, and it appeared to me that he was merely conjuring a name when he introduced himself as Jesse. Something within me triggered a small alarm. Yeah, I'm not one to stir up paranoia without cause, so I attempted to dismiss it and continue with my life. However, a few weeks later, as I was heading out for work, I spotted a guy emerging from Jesse's flat. For some reason, the guy instilled a sense of unease in me, yet I brushed it off and offered him a greeting, which he returned with a nonchalant demeanor. I inquired whether he was a friend of Jesse's or merely his roommate, and at that moment, the atmosphere shifted, heavy with the unmistakable scent of alcohol on his breath. The man responded that his name was Jesse, and while I wasn't entirely convinced by his answer, he reiterated the claim, asserting he was indeed Jesse Smite. I released it and descended the stairs, yet I was aware of his deception, which cast an unsettling shadow over everything. The situation unfolded further. As in the weeks that followed, I observed various individuals entering and exiting Jesse's apartment at all hours, and my doubts grew stronger. At last, when the landlord arrived to gather the rent for the upcoming month, I brought up the tenants next door and inquired about who resided there. The man paused, scratching his head thoughtfully before finally revealing that his name was Stephen, claiming he was the finest tenant he had ever encountered. He made his payment promptly, and there were no disturbances or issues whatsoever, ensuring that everything was flawless. That left me a bit perplexed, yet I found myself harboring a suspicion. I was on the verge of sharing the various individuals I had encountered in that apartment, but I hesitated. I prefer to steer clear of other people's issues, and while this seemed somewhat dubious, it wasn't my role to take on the role of an investigator. I've always preferred to stay out of others' affairs, so I chose to remain silent. Ultimately, as long as it posed no threat to me or others, I saw no reason to intervene, though I truly regret ending up in that predicament. A week later, I found myself in the comfort of my bed, deep in slumber, when a sudden noise stirred me from my dreams. It felt as if a heavy presence was making its way up the stairs. and I instinctively understood that it was connected to Jesse's apartment across the hall. While I attempted to gather my thoughts, I resolved it was time to voice my concerns to the landlord. Just as this notion crossed my mind, a series of loud bangs echoed against my door. It felt like they were intent on dismantling it. "Officers, please open the door, or we will be forced to break it down." My heart raced so quickly that I could feel it in. Every inch of me felt immobilized, as if a heavy weight had settled upon my entire being. What on earth are the police doing in my apartment? I wondered, but nothing made sense. I had a feeling it was connected to Jesse's apartment. A brief moment of panic enveloped me before I summoned my strength, dashed to the door, and yanked on the lock before swinging it open. The next moment, a blinding light enveloped me, and as my vision cleared, I found myself staring at a group of policemen standing in the doorway, armed and clad in tactical vests. In silence, one of them forced me to the ground, swiftly securing my wrists with handcuffs while barking orders for me to remain still. After a moment in that uncomfortable position, with my face pressed against the ground, I heard another officer mention that they were attempting to open the apartment across from us. Yes, Jesse's, but there was no response, and the tension in the air was escalating with each passing second. A law enforcement officer retrieved a tool to pry open the lock as they called for quiet. In a haunting twist, an officer emerged from the apartment, pulling along a girl who appeared to be no older than 17. She was adorned with bruises, and her hair was a chaotic tangle, utterly untidy. I felt the weight of the world bearing down on me when I saw her. In a moment of sheer panic, I turned to one of the officers, my voice trembling, and said, "Officer." However, he cut me off, interjecting with, "Let me guess, you were completely unaware of this?" "I swear I didn't," I said to him, horrified, my voice barely above a whisper. Yet, with a cold expression, he replied, "Save that for the interview." And at that moment, something shattered within me. They brought me to the station, and a torrent of questions flooded in. Whispers of human trafficking rings swirled around, and a wave of panic washed over me. I wept as they pressed me to admit to something I had not done, and I insisted to them that I was completely bewildered by their words, that I would never become entangled in something akin to that. When they finally released me, I was appalled to discover that all of this had been unfolding right beneath my very eyes, while I was exchanging smiles and light conversation with my neighbors. The harsh truth of what was unfolding behind those doors struck me with the force of a freight train. Fortunately, the victim herself cleared me of any wrongdoing, confirming to the officers that I was not among the men involved in her abduction. It shattered my heart to learn that this unfortunate girl had been taken and sold to the highest bidder by a group of misfits. Shortly after, I came to the conclusion that I could no longer remain there. I returned to live with my parents because the anxiety of uncertainty about my surroundings became too much to handle. Shaking off the stress of my breakup was surprisingly simple, as my mind was consumed with thoughts of everything that had transpired in that place. My experience has shown me that even when you feel a bit uneasy, it's important to voice your concerns if something feels off, regardless of whether it is. Reaching out to law enforcement or seeking clarification is crucial. The choices they make can determine the line between existence and oblivion, between a person's liberty and a life filled with terror behind those walls. Therefore, always speak up if something feels off. At times, the opportunity to act justly can rescue an individual from a dreadful destiny. The arrival of autumn was upon us, and the nights began to stretch longer. I found myself alone in the house I shared with my roommate, battling the familiar gloom of the season. I chose to remain indoors and indulge in one of those languid evenings. I was sprawled on the sofa, scrolling through Netflix, when an unsettling sensation washed over me, as if something was amiss. It wasn't merely the usual nagging feeling of idleness. It was something deeper, more profound. I sensed that everything around me was crumbling. It's somewhat akin to the sensation you get when you notice a tire losing air while you're on the road. That's essentially how I would characterize it. Confused and somewhat uneasy, I turned off the TV and made my way upstairs, leaving the lights aglow below. Upon arriving at the top floor, I flicked on the hallway light and stepped into the bathroom. I didn't sense any eyes upon me, yet an unsettling feeling lingered, as though the very atmosphere had shifted. I decided to play some music on my phone and take a shower to distract myself from that strange feeling that was weighing on me for no apparent reason. Had I owned pets, I likely would have observed their reactions, but alas, I never had any. Instead, I attempted to dismiss the unease that was creeping in on me. As I was on the verge of undressing, a sound from downstairs caught my attention. I paused the music for a brief moment, yet the noise did not return. I thought I might be imagining things, or that my roommate had returned early. I never imagined, even for a moment, that an unfamiliar face could have slipped into my home. Such occurrences are meant for others, never for me. Confidence washed over me as I reassured myself that every door was securely locked and that my surroundings were peaceful and serene. I stepped into the shower, hoping to find some tranquility, yet the sense of unease crept back in. As I stepped outside, I switched off my phone. Glancing toward the bathroom door, I caught sight of a shadow lingering just beyond. The sole barrier between that figure and myself was the aged wooden door, complete with its latch, which any simpleton could shatter it with sufficient strength. The individual on the opposite side remained silent, neither knocking nor making any sound. The silence was so profound that their breathing was almost imperceptible, sending a shiver down my spine. Who or what was this figure, and what were they doing in my home? How did they manage to enter? Without my awareness? I found myself lost in thought, standing still, as a chill sweat began to trickle down my forehead. In a moment of panic, I resolved to take action, so I carefully stepped out of the shower and considered it might be preferable to exit through the window. With great caution, I eased the bathroom window open, pulled the frame aside, and slipped outside. However, as I dangled my legs through the opening, I struck them against the blinds. They reverberated, producing a sound that filled the room. Suddenly, I heard the bathroom door creak open just behind me as I attempted to descend from the ceiling. As I finally landed on the patio floor, I sprang to my feet and dashed over to my neighbor's house without hesitation. Reflecting on the past, I rapped on the back door until they finally opened it for me, and as soon as I stepped inside, I dialed the police. Upon their arrival, they scoured my house, only to discover it was vacant. Yet, every room revealed evidence that someone had been sifting through my belongings, sorting through my belongings and the drawers. The officers conveyed to me that the intruder had. I wandered from room to room while I was in the shower, and they discovered a trail of DNA that suggested he had been observing me while I was unwinding on the sofa. The man had been biding his time, patiently anticipating the moment I would drift off, allowing him to slip in through the back door. He might have found me in the bathroom, but he chose to wait for the right moment. He simply didn't anticipate slipping out through the window. Understanding this, I came to the conclusion that that night could have taken so many different turns for the worse. If I hadn't followed my instincts and remained, if I had extinguished the lights behind me, or if only the visitor had taken action earlier, the conclusion of this tale might have unfolded in an entirely different manner. Life has a remarkable way of transforming in the blink of an eye. With a mere roll of the dice, the outcome could have resulted in a vastly different toll of lives lost. At this moment, I'm uncertain about the identity of that individual or the reasons behind his choice of my residence. Yet I've gained a distinct understanding. I will never again question my instincts. So for all who listen, please remain vigilant. Remain vigilant about your environment. Prioritize safety even if it seems unnecessary. And always heed that quiet voice within you that signals something is amiss. It could be a matter of life and death. Nearly a year had passed since I completed high school, and to be honest, the thought of attending university or enlisting in the army didn't appeal to me at all. There I found myself, ensnared in the monotony of my unremarkable hometown, caught in a relentless cycle that felt like a legacy passed down through generations. My days unfolded in a haze of Xanax and a couple of drinks, and truthfully, I felt as if I were destined to relive the family saga. I realized it was time to break free, so I chose to register for a site focused on agricultural opportunities, something I stumbled upon online, a platform that provides a program where you can work on farms in return for food and accommodation. The place I selected was a Hare Krishna community nestled in the deep south of the United States. Upon arrival, my trusty old Camry, purchased secondhand for roughly $600, chose that very moment to break down, leaving me stranded with the nearest town a good 20 miles away. There I found myself, surrounded by a crowd of hipsters who could drive anyone to the brink of madness. A third of the community consisted of Indian immigrants, with a few elderly individuals genuinely in search of a spiritual experience. However, the majority appeared more preoccupied with practicing yoga and discussing their awakenings while comfortably nestled in their self-satisfied bubble. I attempted to keep my distance, yet there were moments when I found myself pulled into discussions about crystals and energies. In my quest for a deeper connection, I encountered a man named Samuel at just the right moment. A few days prior, I had come across his name. They claimed he was unmotivated and somewhat eccentric, that he would spend countless hours confined in his room practicing yoga rather than contributing to the work on the farm. One night, he showed up quite late, expressing his desire to become more engaged in agriculture. Samuel was a man in his early 30s, sporting the appearance of a Hasidic rabbi with curly looped sideburns. His manner of speaking resembled that of a cartoon character, frequently punctuating his sentences with a and like. Ultimately, he was a decent person. Our friendship blossomed swiftly, perhaps due to the fact that we were the sole Texans in the community. We found joy in exchanging tales about our high school teachers, reminiscing about the popular spots every Texan frequents, and exploring the unique aspects that shape our identity. We also discussed soccer and, naturally, beers and substances. He had wild ideas, even mentioned using explosives and mind control to repair his car that was trapped in the garage. He asserted that his purpose for being there was to befriend the gurus and to discover a type of meditation that granted him the ability to influence others. At one point, he mentioned that he had supposedly used Reiki to seduce a girl at a party, and that's when I realized why he had that reputation for being peculiar. The most amusing part is how seriously he took everything, yet I couldn't help but find his enthusiasm quite entertaining. I realized that eventually I would hit a limit I couldn't tolerate any longer, yet I chose to endure it for a few more days just to have someone to keep me company. One day, while sharing a meal with one of the gurus, I recounted to Samuel my visit to a farm that once served as the headquarters for a notorious cult, the Branch Davidians of Waco. I was unsure whether he was aware of the story, so I recounted the shootout, the FBI siege, and all the ensuing drama. However, when I mentioned the deaths, he completely lost it. He was convinced that the authorities were going after those who spoke the truth, and he was furious. In that instant, I felt a strong urge to convey to him that the leader of that cult was far from a martyr. Rather, he was a sociopath driven solely by a thirst for power. Yet, it was clear we were not aligned in our understanding. At one point, the discussion became rather heated, and I found myself increasingly frustrated with his perspective. Every time I attempted to clarify the actual narrative, he would merely shake his head and insist that I was mistaken. It felt as though I was ensnared in a perpetual loop of his outbursts. At last, I reached my limit and rose from the table. I chose to return to the farm, thinking the fresh air might ease my mind. To my surprise, he trailed behind me. After another half hour of frustration over our ridiculous argument, I reached my limit. I turned to him, irritation bubbling over, and declared, "I'm done having this discussion with you. I can't anticipate that someone who arrived here in search of superpowers would possess any rational thought." As I spoke, Samuel's gaze turned towards me. Filled with an intensity of anger I had never encountered in anyone before, and he lunged at me. Samuel loomed large, towering over me with his height and age, leaving me with no hope in a confrontation. I dashed back to the room, but he was right on my heels. In that instant, I began to rummage through my pockets, regretting that I hadn't taken the knife with me before departing the cabin. I understand it may seem unusual, but in my previous neighborhood, venturing outside without some form of protection was simply not an option. Moreover, on the farm, it proved to be quite a handy tool, making it wise to have it on hand. Fortunately, I had it on hand, so I pulled it out and warned Samuel to back off. In that instant, I noticed his moment of uncertainty. He paused for a moment, then returned to complete his lunch. The following day, I sought out the temple leader to share the events that had transpired, proposing that perhaps we ought to take some action regarding him. In the end, he was largely overlooked, and his contributions to the farm were minimal. The leader confided in me that he was a recovering alcoholic, grappling with his demons for over a decade, and had sought refuge on this farm in pursuit of sobriety. The oddity was that he never shared that with me, despite the trust we had already built in our relationship. That afternoon, I observed someone carrying suitcases for him from my window. Samuel was preparing to depart, which left me somewhat perplexed. However, the reality is that the ambience started to brighten a little once he was gone. A few weeks had gone by since Michael's departure, and I had nearly erased the entire episode from my mind. However, one evening, a text message arrived. "Hi, this is Samuel. Is it possible to take my car out for $280? I wish to depart." I chose not to respond. I found myself perplexed by the message as well, and with no clue as to how he obtained my number, I speculated that perhaps he had searched for me on social media or something. It was strange, certainly, but it paled in comparison to the events that unfolded a few nights later. A few nights later, I found myself in the temple office, utilizing the Wi-Fi to send some emails. Upon my return, as I approached my cabin, I was startled by some enormous noises emanating from a barn. Back then, I assumed it was likely just an animal, but if it was indeed an animal, it had to be a massive one. I didn't give it much thought and entered my hut, which lacked a lock, but the door to my room was secure. I felt somewhat uneasy about the banging, yet I believed I was exaggerating. Later that night, I found myself awake, compelled to visit the bathroom, yet the cabin lacked the necessary facilities. There is a bathroom available. We had nothing more than a communal outhouse. Nevertheless, I found myself reluctant to slip on my shoes and venture outside into the shadows, so I opted to relieve myself in the sink instead. I understand it's unpleasant, but since I was the only one using the kitchen, what difference did it make? However, as I swung the door to my room wide, I found myself nearly experienced a heart attack. In the corner of the kitchen, Samuel sat, entirely unclothed, his back turned to the room as he faced the wall. I emitted an involuntary sound, reminiscent of the kind you might encounter in a classic Scooby-Doo episode. Animated series. My noise caught his attention, and all he did was glance at me and shake his body, resembling an ancient tree on the verge of collapsing. In a heartbeat, I shut the door and secured the lock, fully aware of his intentions to soothe me with one of his calming techniques. In a moment of instinct, I dialed 911, and I refrained from approaching the door or venturing close to it until the red and blue lights began to illuminate my surroundings. Pain. When the police finally showed up, Samuel had already vanished. It seems he may have wandered off into the woods. I shared the events that had unfolded, yet there was little they could offer in terms of assistance. No one had any knowledge of him, not even his surname. I had to depart from the farm soon. Subsequently, contacting the authorities in this place was highly discouraged. Those old free spirits appeared to be dodging military recruitment or something along those lines, and truthfully, I wasn't concerned about their opinions. All I desired was to escape from that place. I could never find rest, knowing that Samuel remained lost in those woods, possibly filled with even more anger than before. I remained alert for days, anticipating my friend's arrival to rescue me, and when he finally showed up, I left that place behind for good and never returned. Luckily, I never received any communication from Samuel once more. It was undoubtedly one of the most frightening and strange experiences I have ever encountered.